Hello everyone, and welcome back to The Beatles Forever. In our last episode, the Beatles and Brian were having a rough time on their tours overseas. First they got to Tokyo and got death threats because they were playing at Budokan, a sacred hall. And then next they got into trouble in the Philippines when the Beatles didn't go to the royal palace when asked. It was all a misunderstanding, but some of the Filipinos got angry, and when the Beatles got on board a plane out of the country, they got a bit roughed up. So let's see what's going on today. Brian and the Beatles felt that the Far East tour had been a strain, and they all agreed never again. Brian immediately canceled a trip that Cilla Black was supposed to go to the Philippines, and there was a press conference at 6:30 a.m. at London Airport. John Lennon said he was petrified. George Harrison said they had been treated with Gestapo-like tactics. Brian, at home at Chapel Street, had a worry so much that it gave him a rash that covered his body, and he was diagnosed with glandular fever. The doctor said it would be 2 weeks before he could travel. Epstein called Nat Weiss to postpone a trip to New York. He was going to coordinate the forthcoming tour by the Beatles, and Brian was disappointed. He loved organizing American tours. It was safe territory with lots of friends of Beatlemania. Nat asked Brian what glandular fever was, and Nat said, "Here we call it mononucleosis." So Brian repeated the word to his secretary, and he told her to use it officially to the British people that asked about it. He said it sounds more impressive. And so Brian was recuperating at Port Merion, North Wales, and Brian told his mother by phone he was bored, but that a break was essential before his upcoming American tour. This boredom only lasted a weekend when he got a call by Nat Weiss. Nat said that Brian needed to come to America because he got a call from Birmingham, Alabama disc jockey. And the disc jockey asked him if he had called the Beatles' office, and then he said that they were burning Beatle records. And 3 other similar calls came in shortly after that. Next, there was a news flash stating that the Memphis City Council was considering a ban on an upcoming trip by the Beatles. So now this made the 3rd time the Beatles were in trouble. This crisis started when at the interview John Lennon had given 5 months earlier. John had said, "Christianity will go, it will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue with that. I'm right, and I will be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus right now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. Jesus was all right, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me." And the Beatles, in the Britain article by one of the Beatles' regular commentators, Maureen Cleave, it was accepted as another outspoken interview with the most thoughtful and articulate Beatle. Now, unexpectedly, it was reprinted under a syndication agreement with an American magazine date book, and it was featured on the cover. America, that had treated them so well for 2 years, was about to deal them a most devastating blow. Weiss's office was overloaded with calls from Deep South's Bible Belt, saying that Lennon's sacrilegious remarks would be punished. As the Ku Klux Klan marched, Beatle records were thrown into a bonfire, and 35 stations banned their music. It was the start of the Holy War, Weiss had reported by telephone from Manhattan to Port Merion. Even though he was sick, Brian decided he had to fly to New York right away. He called Alistair Taylor, who made the travel arrangements at NIMS. Brian said, "Give me a plane tomorrow to the States." In New York Kennedy Airport, it was packed with reporters. Weiss grabbed Brian by the arm and got him into the car. Brian said, "How much would it cost to cancel the Beatles tour?" Weiss said, $1 million. Brian said, "Well, I'll do it. I can't let anything happen to anyone. This tour is not going out. Now let's go out and have a good time and deal with it tomorrow." So Weiss was stunned and horrified by Brian's flippancy. He wanted an immediate debate on the crisis, and he told Brian, "This is serious." Brian agreed it was important, but let's go out and have a good dinner and find some people and have some fun. At Manhattan's Sheraton Hotel, Brian was anxious for a good atmosphere at his personal press conference there the next day. He asked about the hors d'oeuvres that would be served to the journalists and asked Nat to charter a boat for a 2-day vacation when the mess had subsided. With Brian, it often seemed that the ugliest news or situations had to be balanced by sunshine on the horizon. Before his own press conference, Epstein called Lennon at his Surrey home, and Brian told John the only way to preserve the tour was for John to apologize. Otherwise, there was not a way their safety could be guaranteed. Lennon said, "Tell them to get stuffed. I've got nothing to apologize for. cancel the tour. I'd rather that than have to get up and lie. What I said stands." So Epstein gave his own explanation to the press. The quote which John Lennon made to a London columnist 3 months ago has been quoted and misrepresented entirely out of context of the article, which was in fact highly complimentary to Lennon as a person and was understood by him to be exclusive to the Evening Standard. It was not anticipated that it would be displayed out of context and in such a manner as it was in an American teenage magazine. This was inadequate. Brian had failed to make the subtle but crucial point that John was not being blasphemous. It was not claiming Beatles' superiority over the church. He should have stressed John's characterization of the Beatles as more popular, not bigger. Lennon was making a social observation, but Epstein would not accept this recommended explanation. It was not for him ever, he said, to interpret a Beatles' words. Brian's press conference was cosmetic, and he knew it. What America now wanted, needed, and demanded was John Lennon. Brian called him again. Now that he'd heard the death threats and saw the other trouble surrounding the tour, Epstein was convinced that John had to explain himself. The Beatles always did pre-tour public relations in America, and John agreed to face the media at the Chicago press conference, already scheduled for a few days later at the city's Astor Towers Hotel. Meanwhile, the American promoters had persuaded Brian to get the tour to continue. A Lennon explanation would calm the controversy. Epstein had fears after Japan and the Philippines that the problem might get out of hand. Uncharacteristically, he felt that the final decision about this tour should be made with John. In the Chicago hotel room, there was emotion there, and he spelled the danger to Lennon, but said he had assured that America did, after all, love the Beatles, and that with a fair press, the tour could go ahead. A cancellation could cause enormous difficulties, and John broke down and wept, his head in his hands. He was full of remorse for having got the Beatles into such a mess on the eve of what should have been their finest American tour. Brian turned away. He could not bear to see Lennon, of all people, in tears. There were times that Brian hadn't liked Lennon's outspokenness within the press, but this was time to repair. They were in a no-win situation. John didn't want to apologize, and Brian wanted the tour to go ahead. Brian said the tour is on. The only thing that would alter that now is if John decides, and it's in his hands. So John faced the press. If I had said television is more popular than Jesus, I might have gotten away with it. But I just happened to be talking to a friend, and I used the word Beatles as a remote thing. I'm not anti-God, anti-Christ, or anti-religion. I was not saying we're greater or better. I believe in God, but not as an old man in the sky. I used Beatles because it was easier for me to talk about Beatles. I wasn't saying whatever they're saying I was saying. I'm sorry I said it, really. I never meant it to be a lousy, anti-religious thing. I apologize if that will make you happy. There were a few more exchanges with the journalists, and John ended the conference with, "There's nothing more to be said," and the tour went ahead. The Deep South and the Bible Belt, that was the danger zone. As Brian stood by the side of the stage in Memphis, a loud firecracker from the audience went off and frightened everybody. His head spun around to fix on John, but the band played on. While the Memphis concert took place, a religious meeting was held in town to pray for the forgiveness of the audience. But the tour was a big success. The Beatles revisited Shea Stadium in New York and went on to Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles, attracting more fans than during their 1965 tour. For Brian, it signaled a massive change in his behavior. On the 1965 U.S. tour, he had stood alongside the Beatles at the press conferences and at concerts, usually and at concerts, and his position was in the wings. In 1966, he was hardly there. The Beatles concert at Candlestick Park, San Francisco, August 29, 1966, proved to be their last anywhere. Lennon and Harrison were the ones that wanted to stop touring. George had said for a while that going on the road was a charade, that their music, unheard above the screaming thousands, was suffering. He wanted the Beatles to spend more time in the studio. John needed little persuasion, and he found touring uncomfortable and tiring. Paul McCartney asked Tony Barrow to tape the concert, a sure omen that it was special. Even though Brian knew it was the end of the Beatles' tours after the San Francisco concert, he couldn't bring himself to go to the show. He did not want to have the night to become a special event or a finale. It was not the end of the Beatles, nor would Brian concede to anyone that this was their concert exit. The warning signs had been there on a few occasions when he caught up with the group on the U.S. tour. "This is it," John and George would say to Brian after a difficult show or when their equipment caused problems. Brian believed it was Jesus Christ controversy and was hopeful that it might not be the end of the road. He felt that when they got back to London and the dust settled, they would still want to do live shows again. He knew better than to try and change their minds in the middle of the tour, and he never replied when they kept insisting that this was their last tour. It wasn't surprising that he wasn't at the San Francisco concert. For him, it was just another end of the tour appearance. Had he boarded their charter plane back to Los Angeles after the show, he would have seen George Harrison flop into his seat and with a broad grin announce, "Well, that's it. I'm not a Beatle anymore." Told of their decision and asked about it by Tony Barrow, who now faced questions from the world's press, Brian remained convinced that they would tour Britain later that year. He showed a provisional itinerary to Barrow, who asked if he could announce such plans to the clamoring media. "No," said Brian firmly. "There would be hell to pay if this goes out." Brian refused to have Barrow say that there would be no more tours or that the Beatles planned to concentrate on making records and films. Epstein told Weiss at that time that he was considering 4 solo film parts for the Beatles, but this never happened either. To Brian, it wasn't believable that the raw excitement of the Beatles live, the very essence of their original attraction for him, was gone forever. His way of dealing with things was not to face the truth. While the Beatles were playing their final concert in San Francisco, Brian was going to have a drama in his private life. Earlier that day, at the Beverly Hills Hotel in Los Angeles, where Brian was staying with Nat Weiss, he met up again with Diz Gillespie to visit him at the hotel. Diz was staying with a friend in California, and he phoned Brian and said he wanted to see him. Brian was flattered. He was fond of Diz, and they spent the afternoon swimming in the hotel pool. Brian assured Nat that he had changed. Nat said, "He hasn't changed. Get rid of him." "Oh, you don't understand. He loves me," Brian said. And Nat said, "Yes, he really loves you and all your money. Stay away from him. He's a cheap hustler. If you wanted to keep your beer cold, you'd put it next to his heart. I don't trust him." Weiss said that Brian was always fascinated by the dangerous aspects of this person. He had an amazing control over Brian, and this boy's attitude was that Brian had made so much money and he wanted to get his share of the way things were going. And Brian used to tell me that the Beatles used to like Diz, and this was untrue, probably a ploy by Brian to have Nat more tolerant of Gillespie. In fact, he was the only boyfriend of Brian's whom the Beatles knew, and with their renowned antenna for problem people, they made it known to all their insiders that they felt uncomfortable in Gillespie's company. "All 4 Beatles really disliked him," said one of the Beatles' friends. Nat said he was sure the Beatles would say they liked anyone who was with Brian, just as polite persons show civility to anyone's partner, perhaps going home to saying they were just terrible. So Weiss continued to warn Brian, emphasizing Diz was a hustler. "Don't tell me about these kind of people, Brian, because I know what they are all about." After the sociable time with Diz, Brian thought their relationship was on again. As the Beatles began their concert, Brian and Nat went out to dinner in the Beverly Hills Hotel. When Weiss got back to his room, he noticed a briefcase was missing, and he told Brian, and then Brian noticed his was gone too. There was nothing much of value in Weiss's suitcase. Brian, those contained contracts for the Beatles tour, a bottle of Seconal barbiturates, which were illegal, and they didn't have to wait long to find out who took them. A ransom arrived from Gillespie asking for $10,000 for the return of the briefcases. The threat was that Epstein's possession of barbiturates would be revealed. By now, Weiss said, "I hated him, and I really was out to get him." After 2 days of anguish, Brian flew back to London. He told Nat not to act, but to let it go. He asked Wendy Hansen to buy a new briefcase from Asprey's. Her heart sank when she heard the news. She knew what was in the stolen case. Weiss said that Brian didn't want the publicity and didn't want Diz into trouble because he was afraid of the scandal. But Weiss was determined to pursue it. Weiss said, "My logic was, if he stole my briefcase, I wanted him arrested." Weiss hired a private detective to arrange a meeting with Gillespie at a railway station. the rendezvous was a trap, and Gillespie was arrested by the police. Weiss sent Brian's briefcase on to London. About half the $20,000 it contained was returned, and the contracts were intact. The bottle that contained the Seconal pills was empty. Brian was very upset that I had him arrested, said Weiss. He was very depressed by the whole thing. The whole betrayal is what really destroyed him. The incident deeply affected Brian, whose life code was based on trust, and later the realization that he had been so humiliated on the final night of what was to become the last ever Beatle tour was the ultimate personal devastation. The end of the Beatles' touring days was dispiriting in every way for Brian, emotionally, professionally, and financially. The Shea Stadium concert was 11,000 seats undersold, and tickets to fill the venue had been given away, and a Beatles concert had been papered. A year earlier, Shea had a genuine capacity crowd. It was a bitter finale to the Beatles' days of touring. So I'm going to end the video here. In this episode, the Beatles had a rough time in America because of John and his interview stating the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. They had their records burned, and the press wanted an apology. John gave a half-hearted one. After that, the Beatles were afraid of touring and were getting tired of it because of all the traveling. They wanted, George and John wanted, to work more in the studio. After that, Brian had trouble with his old love, Diz. Things just seemed to be falling apart. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. As I mentioned before, I created a list of merchandise from Amazon that I thought you might be interested in. If you click on the link, it takes you to the Amazon page. If you purchase anything, I get a small commission that's of no extra cost to you. But more importantly, I wish everyone a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.